Britain looks like a country that has always been stable. Same borders, same monarchy, same parliament, same traditions. It feels solid, like nothing ever really threatened it. That feeling is wrong. Britain didn't glide through history. It stumbled. It nearly collapsed. It nearly split apart. It nearly lost control more times than most people ever hear about. And the scary part is this: most people only know about 3 of those moments. The rest are buried, softened, skipped, or turned into simple stories that hide how close Britain came to becoming something completely different. This video is about the moments that didn't just happen, they changed everything. Moments where power shifted hands. Moments where violence rewrote the rules. Moments where Britain survived, but only by giving something up. And once you see them together, one thing becomes clear. Modern Britain is built on a series of shocks, not stability. We like to think history moves forward neatly. Kings rule, parliaments grow, rights expand, progress happens. But real history doesn't work like that. It lurches, it breaks, it reacts, and Britain is a perfect example of that. This video isn't a school lesson. It's not a list of dates to memorize. It's a story about fragility. About how a country that looks permanent was shaped by moments that could have ended it. Some of these moments lasted days. Some lasted years. Some still echo right now. And most people only recognize the obvious ones. The big names. The neat chapters. But the truth is, Britain was changed forever by events that didn't look dramatic at the time. Decisions that seemed small. Crises people thought would pass. Choices leaders believed they could control. They couldn't. That's the problem at the heart of this video. We remember history as calm because it helps us feel safe. But calm is often an illusion created later. The challenge here is not listing what happened. It's understanding why these moments mattered, and why forgetting them changes how we see Britain today. Because if you believe Britain was always stable, then modern problems feel shocking, confusing, unfair. But if you understand that instability is baked into the story, today makes more sense. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Every time Britain survived, it paid a price. Power moved upward or sideways. Rights expanded for some and shrank for others. Wealth shifted. Voices were silenced. New rules were written. Survival is never free. That's why these moments matter more than the dates attached to them. They explain why Britain looks the way it does now, why Parliament is powerful, why the monarchy is limited, why class still matters, why identity is complicated, why trust in institutions rises and falls. But here's the reason most people only know 3 of these moments. History is often taught backwards. We start with the outcome and work our way back, making everything look inevitable. As if Britain was always going to end up like this. As if the right people always won. As if the system always corrected itself. That's comforting. It's also misleading. At the time, nobody knew how these moments would end. People were scared, confused, angry, divided. They made decisions under pressure, not wisdom. And sometimes, those decisions worked. Sometimes, they made things worse. But all of them changed Britain forever. Another challenge is how history is filtered through power. Moments that make institutions look strong get highlighted. Moments that show chaos get softened. Moments that show ordinary people shaping events get reduced. Over time, the story becomes clean. Too clean. This video pulls that apart. Because when you line these moments up, from early invasions to political revolutions, from disease to industrial change, a pattern emerges. Britain doesn't change slowly. It changes when it's forced to. When power breaks. When systems fail. When pressure builds until something snaps. And those snaps are the real turning points. This matters now more than ever. People talk about Britain being divided, about institutions being under strain, about trust fading, about the future feeling uncertain. That's not new. It's familiar. Britain has been here before, many times. And every time, it came out different on the other side. Sometimes better, sometimes worse. Always changed. So the real challenge of this video is this: can you recognize Britain's future without understanding how fragile its past really was? Because if you believe stability is the default, every crisis feels like the end. But if you understand that crisis is the engine of change, the story shifts. This video will walk through 15 moments that forced Britain to become something else. Not the moments that sound good on paper, not the moments that fit neatly into lessons, but the moments where Britain lost control and had to adapt or break. Some of these moments created rights, some created suffering, some created systems we still live under today. And by the time we reach the final one, the most important one, you'll realize something uncomfortable. Modern Britain didn't emerge because everything worked. It emerged because enough things didn't. Let's start with the moments people rarely think about, the ones that quietly set everything else in motion. Most people in Britain can name a few big history moments on the spot. 1066, Henry VIII. World War II, maybe Magna Carta if they remember it from school. And that's exactly the point. The history most of us carry around is a small highlight reel. There are a few reasons that happens. First, school history is designed for exams, not understanding. It focuses on topics that are easy to test, a clear timeline, a few famous names, a few memorable battles, and a neat conclusion. Messy periods, where power is unclear, sources are limited, and outcomes aren't simple, often get rushed or skipped. Second, countries like telling a story that makes them look stable. Britain is often presented as a nation that naturally became democratic, naturally built strong institutions, and naturally led the world at different points. But the real story is often chaos first, order later. When you teach the chaos properly, it forces uncomfortable questions: who lost? Who gained? Who decided what counts as of Britain or at all? Third, many turning points don't feel dramatic in the moment. Some changes were slow, some were legal, some were administrative, some were caused by things people couldn't fight, like disease, migration, or the collapse of an empire. Those moments don't give you an easy hero versus villain story, so they don't stick in popular memory. But here's the twist: those quiet moments are often the ones that permanently rewired Britain. That's why this soft reveal phase matters. These first 5 moments aren't always the ones people talk about at parties, but they set up almost everything that comes later. Who owns land, who has power, what a state even looks like, and why Britain's identity is so layered. So let's start at moment number 15 and build upward. Moment number 15, AD 43, the Roman invasion of Britain. If you want to understand why Britain's later history is full of roads, towns, walls, and central control, you start here. In AD 43, the Roman Emperor Claudius launched the invasion that began Rome's conquest of Britain. Over the following decades, Roman armies expanded control across much of what is now England and Wales, creating the province of Britannia. This wasn't just a military event. It was the beginning of a new kind of Britain, one tied into a huge empire with taxation, bureaucracy, and infrastructure. Roman rule helped introduce urban centers, towns built around administration and trade, major roads and military routes, a money economy in many areas, and a model of law and governance that later rulers tried to imitate. The reason most people forget how big this was is because it's so far back it feels like ancient trivia. But it's not trivia. It's one of the first times Britain was truly run as part of a wider state system. This is one of the most important forgotten turning points because it proves something: even the most powerful system can simply leave. By around 410, Roman authority in Britain had effectively collapsed as military forces withdrew and Britain was left to defend itself. A famous detail often referenced is the message associated with Emperor Honorius, telling communities to look to their own defense because Rome couldn't help. The impact was massive: central government weakened or vanished, towns declined, local power became more important than imperial rules, and Britain entered a long, messy transition into post-Roman kingdoms. This moment matters because it created the conditions for big cultural shifts later, especially the growth of new political units and the beginnings of Anglo-Saxon settlement. And it also created a theme you'll see again in British history: when central power fades, local identity and local conflict rise. Most people know a 1066, but they often don't grasp what it really means. It wasn't just a battle, it was a full elite replacement. On the 14th of October, 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, defeated King Harold Godwin's son at the Battle of Hastings, a decisive event in the conquest of England. After that, England changed in deep, structural ways. A new ruling class took over land and power. Castles spread across the country as tools of control. Governance became more tightly linked to the king, and landholding was reorganized under Norman authority. This conquest shaped the language of power too. Norman French influenced law, culture, and administration. Even today, a lot of English legal vocabulary and class language reflects that mixed heritage. People remember 1066 because it's easy to test. But what's often missed is the scale of the change. England became a different kind of kingdom, more centralized, more controlled, and more connected to continental politics. Here's a moment that sounds boring until you realize what it really was: state power written down. The Domesday Book was completed in 1086 as part of the Great Survey ordered by William the Conqueror, recording who held land, what it was worth, and what was owed. The National Archives notes the survey was ordered at Christmas 1085 and carried out the following year, capturing landholding and how land was used. Why does this matter? Because Domesday wasn't just paperwork. It was a tool of control. It helped the crown understand wealth and taxation capacity, it strengthened the king's authority over land disputes, and it made England one of the best documented medieval societies in Europe. In simple terms, it helped turn conquest into administration. It made the Norman takeover permanent in practice, not just in theory. Magna Carta is famous, but it's often misunderstood. It was agreed in June 1215 and dated the 15th of June, 1215, during a political crisis between King John and rebel barons. The important idea, stated plainly by the UK Parliament's own explainer, is that Magna Carta was one of the first documents to put into writing the principle that the king and government were not above the law. Now, the reality is that Magna Carta didn't create modern democracy overnight. It was originally a deal between elites. It was challenged, rewritten, and argued over. But it became a symbol and a reference point for later fights about rights, justice, taxation, and limits on power. This is the moment where rule by force starts being challenged by rule by agreement, even if the agreement was imperfect and incomplete. These next 5 moments are where British history turns darker and sharper. Power doesn't just shift politely, it gets forced. People die in huge numbers. Institutions break. New rules get written under pressure, and once these happen, Britain doesn't return to what it was before. The Black Death hits Britain. The Black Death wasn't just a disaster. It was a reset button on medieval society. The National Archives notes the plague, often called the Black Death, first came to Britain in 1348 and had devastating effects for centuries. The huge shock wasn't only the deaths, it was what came after, a labor shortage. When a big part of the workforce dies, the people who survive suddenly have bargaining power. Wages rise. Landowners panic. The old feudal system, where peasants had few options, starts to crack, because workers can now demand more or move to better deals. You can see the state trying to clamp down on this in the Statute of Labourers, 1351, which aimed to stop wages rising and to restrict workers from moving around in search of better pay. That's what makes this moment so important. It shows early Britain reacting to crisis by trying to control people, yet the economy is already changing underneath. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it weakened the old order. It changed who had leverage. It planted the seeds for later unrest and social change. If you want a single moment that rewired religion and politics in England, it's 1534. Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, which recognised Henry VIII as supreme head on earth of the Church of England, severing official links with the Pope in Rome. People often reduce this to Henry wanted a divorce. But the bigger point is power. This was the state saying, religious authority in England answers to the crown, not Rome. That decision doesn't just change church services. It changes who controls wealth, property, and loyalty. And it triggers huge follow-on events, including the dissolution of the monasteries, where monastic lands and assets were broken up and transferred, one of the biggest redistributions of property in English history. The National Archives links this directly to the Reformation shift, including the Act of Supremacy. This is escalation because it's a national identity break. It creates centuries of tension between Protestants and Catholics, between crown and dissenters, between the idea of one official religion and the messy reality of belief. After 1534, Britain's politics can't be separated from religion in the same way again. This is where Britain stops pretending disagreement can be solved with speeches. The English Civil Wars were a series of conflicts between supporters of King Charles I, royalists, and supporters of Parliament, parliamentarians, beginning in 1642 and spreading across the British Isles as part of wider conflicts. At the heart of it was a basic question that still echoes today: who runs the country when the king and parliament disagree? Britannica summarizes the build-up. Tensions had been rising, and after Charles's failed attempt to arrest 5 MPs, both sides prepared for war. English Heritage highlights how devastating this period was, calling it a set of wars from 1642 to 1651 and noting the human cost could be up to 200,000 deaths across the conflicts, a huge share of the population at the time. This moment matters because it cracks the idea that monarchy is untouchable. It normalizes the unthinkable, that the nation can fight itself over power, and that the king might lose. Once civil war happens, the old Britain is already dying. If the Civil War is the breakdown, the execution is the point of no return. Charles I was brought to trial in Westminster Hall in January 1649, and Parliament's own history page describes the setting and process leading into the trial. He was executed on the 30th of January, 1649, outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, something historic royal palaces describes as an unprecedented moment, following a momentous trial. This wasn't just killing a man. This was killing an idea that the king rules by divine right and can't be judged. A country publicly executing its monarch changes the relationship between ruler and ruled forever. Even when the monarchy returns later, it returns with a warning burned into the system. Kings can be challenged. They can be removed. Power is not absolute. This is escalation because it makes later constitutional limits feel real, not theoretical. After the civil wars and the chaos that followed, Britain still hadn't fully settled the question of power. The Glorious Revolution is where the system starts to lock into a new shape. Britannica explains that the Glorious Revolution, 1688–89, was driven by religious and political conflict around James II, especially fear of a Catholic dynasty after the birth of his son in 1688. What makes this moment history-changing is what happens next. Parliament doesn't just swap monarchs. It sets conditions. The Bill of Rights, 1689, is one of the key results. Parliament's own description says it firmly established principles like frequent parliaments, free elections, and freedom of speech in Parliament, parliamentary privilege. This is escalation because it moves Britain closer to a constitutional model where the monarch can't simply override the rules. Parliament's authority becomes more central, and the idea of legal limits becomes harder to undo. After 1689, Britain is not the same kind of monarchy it was before. Quick pause, because if you're still watching, you've probably started noticing a pattern. British history isn't a straight line. It's not slow progress, steady stability, then modern democracy. It's more like a series of shocks that force Britain to change shape. Sometimes by choice, often by panic. And here's the part that messes with people. Britain's stability is usually what happens after the crisis, not before it. We've already seen that with the Black Death, the Reformation, the Civil Wars, the execution of a king, and the Glorious Revolution. By now, Britain has learned something brutal. If you want the country to survive, you often have to redesign it. Now we're entering the last stretch before the number one moment, and these next four aren't medieval or distant. These are the moments that begin to feel like the Britain you recognize today. These are the moments that shape who counts as British, where power sits, how work and class operate, and why modern politics still feels tense. Also, this is where most people only know the idea gets real, because people might know the names of these next events, but they usually don't understand what they actually did to Britain underneath the surface. Alright, let's get into moments number 5 to number 2, the pre-climax. A lot of people say Britain like it has always existed. It hasn't. In 1707, the Acts of Union passed in both the English and Scottish parliaments created a new political unit, Great Britain, with the Union coming into effect on the 1st of May, 1707. UK Parliament's history pages describe this as the creation of the United Kingdom called Great Britain, with the UK Parliament meeting for the first time later that year. This is a turning point because it changes what Britain even is. Before 1707, England and Scotland were separate kingdoms, though they shared a monarch since 1603. After 1707, they were tied into one parliamentary state. That creates long-term consequences. Political power becomes more concentrated at Westminster, Scotland's economy and trade become more linked to English systems, identity becomes more complicated, Scottish, English, British, sometimes all at once. And it's not just identity, it's power. The Union was not just a friendship agreement, it was a major political restructure, and you can still feel it today in debates about devolution, independence, and what the UK even means. This is why number 5 matters. It didn't just change policy, it changed the map of the state. If you want to know why Britain has big cities, class politics, labour movements, and deep regional inequality, you look at the Industrial Revolution. Britannica describes the Industrial Revolution as a shift from an agrarian and handicraft economy to one dominated by industry and machine manufacturing, noting it began in Britain in the 18th century and transformed society. This is where Britain becomes a different kind of country. Before industrialization, most people lived and worked locally, often tied to land and seasonal rhythms. Industrialization pulls people into towns and cities, reshapes work into wage labor, and creates a huge new class system built around factories, owners, and workers. It also creates the Britain people still argue about today, the wealthy and the working class, the capital and the regions, the idea that growth is not shared equally. What makes this a pre-climax moment is that it's not one day. It's an engine that keeps running. It builds wealth, and it builds hardship. It creates modern capitalism in Britain, and it creates the backlash to it too. Even today, the parts of Britain that prospered during industrialization, and the parts that were later abandoned, are still dealing with that legacy. This isn't just progress. It's a permanent change in how Britain lives. This is one of the most important and emotionally heavy turning points, because it forces Britain to confront a truth: Britain didn't just benefit from slavery. It was deeply involved in it as a system. Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act 1807, ending Britain's legal participation in the transatlantic slave trade. But slavery itself continued in British colonies until the Slavery Abolition Act 1833, which came into force in 1834. The National Archives explains that the 1833 Act abolished slavery in the British colonies and also links it to the compensation process, meaning enslavers were compensated, while formerly enslaved people were forced into apprenticeship labor for a period. This moment matters for three reasons: moral and political pressure changed law. Abolition campaigns grew powerful enough to force Parliament to act. It reshaped Britain's image of itself. Britain later told a story of being a leader in abolition. That story is part of national identity now, but it sits alongside the reality that enormous wealth had already been built through exploitation. The consequences didn't end in 1834. The economic and social scars of slavery and empire didn't disappear because a law changed. They shaped migration, wealth, global politics, and identity debates for generations. This is a pre-climax turning point because it changes Britain's relationship with empire and morality, but it also shows how messy progress can be when money and power are involved. Most people think of World War I as trenches and battles abroad. But the real Britain changed forever story happens at home. The war demanded manpower at a scale Britain had never managed before, and that pressure led to conscription. The London Gazette's explainer notes how conscription expanded in 1916 and later widened further during the war. But the deeper shift is political. The UK Parliament's history pages explain that the social upheaval of the First World War led to the Representation of the People Act 1918, expanding the vote to all men over 21 and to certain women over 30. That is not a small change. That is Britain redesigning who counts politically. World War I also expands the role of the state, mobilizing industry, organizing labor, rationing, propaganda, managing national survival. Once a government learns it can run society at that scale, the relationship between citizen and state never fully goes back. And there's a psychological shift too. A whole generation is scarred. Communities lose sons, brothers, fathers. Trust in old leadership cracks. People start questioning who benefits from war, who pays the cost, and what the country owes its people in return. World War I is pre-climax because it sets up the final transformation, the moment where Britain doesn't just adjust power at the top, it changes what the state is supposed to do for ordinary people. And that takes us to the number one moment, the one that made modern Britain feel unavoidable. If you had to pick one moment that created modern Britain, not the castles and kings version, but the Britain people actually live in, this is it. Because after World War II, Britain didn't just rebuild roads and buildings. It rebuilt the entire deal between the state and ordinary people. Before this period, life in Britain could be brutally simple. If you were born poor, you often stayed poor. Healthcare was a mix of charity, local services, and private payment. If you got seriously ill at the wrong time, you weren't just fighting disease, you were fighting the cost of it. And then the country did something that still feels shocking even now. It decided that healthcare should be free at the point of use, for everyone, funded by the public system. That single decision changed Britain forever. The groundwork for this moment starts during the war, with the Beveridge Report in November 1942, officially titled Social Insurance and Allied Services. UK Parliament's own learning materials describe it as a blueprint for post-war social policy aimed at tackling major social problems and inequality. This wasn't just a report, it was a promise, a message that after the sacrifices of war, people deserved a safer life. Then comes the political earthquake, the 1945 general election, where a Labour government won a landslide and pushed a new vision of what Britain should be. And that vision wasn't just freedom in a flag-waving sense. It was security, health, housing, welfare, dignity. The clearest symbol of that new Britain was the National Health Service. UK Parliament's history page on the 1946 National Health Service Act explains the key idea in plain words. It became the duty of the Minister of Health to promote a health service to improve physical and mental health, prevent illness, and treat it, and crucially, the services were to be free of charge. It also notes how the Act brought together hospitals, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, opticians, and dentists under one organised system. Now here's what makes this a true changed Britain forever moment. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't agreed on. The NHS had serious opposition. Many doctors worried about losing independence. There were fights over who would run hospitals and how the system would work. Even supporters knew they were trying something massive and risky, but the government pushed it through. And on the 5th of July, 1948, the NHS officially began. Multiple reputable historical summaries mark that date clearly. The UK government's History of Government blog describes the 5th of July, 1948 as the day the NHS was established, highlighting it as a major feature of the British welfare state and noting its free at the point of use principle. The UK Parliament Commons Library also describes the NHS being launched on the 5th of July, 1948 by Aneurin Bevan, and explains the core idea: services free at the point of delivery, financed through general taxation, with hospitals and the wider medical system brought under one umbrella. And Nuffield Trust's history page also clearly states the NHS began on the 5th of July, 1948. So why is this the number one moment? Because it changes the meaning of citizenship. After 1948, being British isn't just about being ruled by the Crown or represented in Parliament. It becomes about what the country owes you as a basic standard of life. If you're sick, you get treated. If you're poor, you're not automatically left behind. The state becomes responsible in a new way. This is also where modern politics starts to make sense. Almost every big argument today, tax, public spending, immigration, inequality, regional neglect, who pays for what, connects back to this era. The welfare state is not just policy, it's identity. That's why people get emotional about it. That's why debates about NHS funding can feel like debates about what Britain even is. And there's another reason this moment is the climax. It flips the story of British power. For centuries, major turning points were about elites, kings versus barons, monarchy versus parliament, religion at the top, wars decided by rulers. But 1945 to 1948 is different. It's the moment where the future of Britain is shaped around ordinary life, health, family, survival. It's the moment where the country says, in effect, we're not going back to the old way. That's why this moment stands above the rest, because even if you don't know the date, you live in the after effects every day. When you step back and look at all 15 of these moments together, a bigger and less comfortable picture appears. Britain did not become what it is through calm progress or careful planning. It became what it is through pressure, through moments where something broke, failed, or collapsed, and the country was forced to respond. That matters, because it changes how we understand British politics, British identity, and British arguments today. A lot of modern debates assume Britain has a natural state of being, that things worked, then stopped working, that the past was stable and the present is broken. But history shows the opposite. Instability is normal. Stability is temporary. From Roman withdrawal to Norman conquest, from plague to religious split, from civil war to industrial shock, Britain only ever changed when it had no other option. Power was rarely given freely. It was taken, limited, or redesigned after conflict. And every time Britain survived one of these moments, it did so by trading something away. After Rome left, Britain traded unity for local rule. After 1066, it traded old elites for stronger central control. After Magna Carta, it traded absolute monarchy for negotiation. After the Black Death, it traded feudal obedience for labor power. After the Reformation, it traded religious unity for state authority. After the Civil Wars, it traded divine kingship for constitutional limits. After industrialization, it traded rural life for economic growth. After Empire and World War, it traded global dominance for internal security. And in 1945 to 1948, it traded the old idea of self-reliance for a promise of shared responsibility. That's the pattern. British history isn't a story of smooth improvement. It's a story of managed loss. Each survival came with a cost. Each success left something behind. This is why modern British politics feels so tense. Arguments about the NHS aren't just about budgets. They're about whether that post-war promise still holds. Arguments about Parliament and the courts aren't just legal. They go back to fights over who really holds power. Arguments about identity, Immigration and belonging aren't new. They echo older moments where Britain had to redefine who counts inside the system. Even debates about decline and nostalgia come from this history. Britain remembers the moments where it felt powerful, but it lives with the consequences of the moments where it chose survival over dominance. And here's the part that often gets missed. None of these moments were guaranteed to end well. The Roman system could have returned. The Norman elite could have fractured the kingdom. Magna Carta could have failed entirely. The civil wars could have ended in permanent dictatorship. Industrialization could have destroyed social cohesion beyond repair. The welfare state could have collapsed under its own weight. At each stage, Britain could have become something else. A weaker state, a harsher one, a more divided one. That's why the title of this video matters. These moments didn't just change Britain. They narrowed its options. Each decision locked in a path and closed others. Once you build a powerful parliament, you can't go back to absolute monarchy without breaking everything. Once you promise healthcare as a right, taking it away feels like betrayal. Once you centralize power, decentralizing it becomes a fight. History creates expectations, and expectations create conflict when they aren't met. So when people today say Britain feels uncertain or unstable, they're not wrong. But they're also not seeing the full picture. Britain has always lived with uncertainty. What changes is how it responds to it. The real lesson from these 15 moments isn't pride or shame. It's awareness. Awareness that Britain didn't arrive fully formed. Awareness that power has always been contested. Awareness that stability is something built after crisis, not before it. And most importantly, awareness that the choices made during pressure moments shape everyday life long after the crisis fades. The reason most people only know 3 of these moments isn't because the others don't matter. It's because remembering them forces us to admit that Britain's story isn't clean or comfortable. But understanding them makes the present clearer. When you know how fragile Britain has been before, modern challenges stop feeling like the end of the story. They start feeling like another chapter. Not an easy one, not a guaranteed one, but one shaped, like all the others, by decisions made under pressure. And that's the real question this history leaves us with. When the next turning point comes, what will Britain choose to trade away to survive? Watch the next video.